Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more overly sarcastic productions, and you know what? I felt like watching Blue's newest video, at least as of recording this. Um, because by the time this gets uploaded, there could be a new Blue history video. I don't know. I'm not sure how far ahead I am in my recordings. I don't feel like doing the math right now, but today we are watching History Summarized. Why is English such a mess? It, I feel like, is the most bastard language out in the world today. Because it's an amalgamation of Latin, Germanic, and uh, French, right? Probably some Gaelic in there from the old Celtic days. Not too sure. Um, uh, right? We had the Romans conquer Britain and rule for a few centuries. And then they left. Germanic tribes came in, and Old English came to be. And then 1066 happens, and the French come in, speaking French. And we kind of get right, but we don't see as much of a like French ends up becoming the language of the elite, whereas Old English, Anglo Saxon, um, did end up becoming the language of the populace, whereas French never did in England post 1066. But we still took things from French into our everyday language. That's really the extent of my knowledge regarding it. I'm not much of a language person. I'm more so, you know, cultural and political sort of thing when it comes to English history. So, with all that yapping done, let's go ahead and hear what Blue has to say regarding this question.
The English language is downright weird. I don't
Yep.
think that's an especially controversial statement, but it's one that warrants some explanation. Sure, much fuss gets made over the nonsensical pronunciation schemes we follow. Today, I present
Or like I before E except after C, except for a bunch of like I feel like I feel like the I feel like that's a wrong statement to make, the I before E except after C, because I swear there are more words where the E comes before the I and there's no C involved. I don't know why that is a rule we teach kids when teaching English. At least that's what I was taught. I don't know if they got rid of that finally because I think it's a stupid rule. It does not make any sense because it does not apply to like I feel like most the average words that we say out of the lexicon of the average words people use in English. We have more of this situation like weird, the E before the I, and there not being a fucking C. This is the one thing I have. This is my one thing that I'll throw hands with the English language over because my God, it's a stupid fucking. Uh,
you with this video, but if I present you, you'd worry about getting stuffed in a box with a bow on it. I may be a Joker, but I am not the Joker, and you can tell the difference by my use of the. Weird indeed, huh? But ultimately pretty surface level. No, the English wackiness goes far deeper. Despite the language's ancestry in Germanic cultures from Northern Europe, half the words in English instead come from French and Latin. Weird. We can partly explain this by pointing to the time William the Conqueror and his Norman French
no, he's only going 1066. I thought he would start sooner.
buddies took over England in 1066, but that's just one plot point in a much longer story. So come with me today on a
Okay, no,
tour
he
of
will be
English,
going
not
farther back.
the English, but English itself, as we piece together how our beautiful mess of a language came about. Now let's do some linguistics. First, a bit of scene setting. Languages don't appear in a vacuum, they come in families. Romance, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic are families of languages that share similarities and origins. Sometimes they can be mutually intelligible, say within the Romance group, a
And they all come from Indo-European.
Spanish speaker can ask a question, get an answer back in Italian, and both participants understand it. But in most cases, there's a distance and friction between a family's languages, with some farther apart than others. English is a Germanic language, meaning it's related to languages from Northern Europe and Scandinavia, but the average English speaker won't comprehend German, Frisian, Yiddish, Norwegian, Swedish, Danish,
Fun fact though, uh in those I read a book recently. I can't remember the name of the author, but it was a book regarding the Anglo-Saxon time period. It went from like early, late. I think it went from 790 around 794 or like early 800s. I'm not sure if it started at the raid on Lindisfarne or not. I can't quite remember. And it went to like the mid 900s or whatever. But primarily, it was like Alfred the Great to um, like a couple kings after him, a few kings after him. I think it stopped at Ethelstan. I think that's where that book stopped. Um, but that author, that historian, talked about, made a note that I didn't quite think was, like I was never too sure about it, but the Anglo Saxons of Alfred the Great's time period, despite the Anglo Saxons having come over to Britain a couple centuries before the Vikings started to raid England, the languages still were close enough where the Viking raiders and conquerors could communicate with the old Anglo Saxons, with the Anglo Saxon speakers. And I thought that was pretty fucking neat that the language had still retained a close enough relation there. Despite not only like a couple centuries of drift, but also England adopting the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, while everyone here was still pagan, like, so obviously the focus of English economy shifted more Mediterranean and Latin based instead of trying to maintain roots over here in Germany and Sweden and whatnot. That makes sense.
Icelandic, Dutch, or Afrikaans if it's spoken to them. And as a student, an English speaker will have the hardest time trying to learn any of the others. Among that group, English is the odd one out. Why? Well, the simplest account is that English was a Germanic language, but then the French showed up. The notion being that English changed after getting sat on by a Norman French monarchy for 150 years. This is true, and it fits cleanly into popular understandings of English history overall, but it's not our main culprit. As I've discovered while researching this video, linguistics is very complicated, so we won't be swimming through all the technical details of how languages work, and we're going to keep this story as clear as possible by building it in layers. Germanic plus Normans was the simplest version. Now here's one layer deeper. Old English.
Okay, I like the organization of this video so far. I like how Blue is tackling this. This is
was
really
a Germanic
neat.
language brought to Britain by migrating tribes called Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, and their language picked up new vocabulary.
Fun fact, I'm reading another Anglo-Saxon book currently, and actually our perspective of this, the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes, is a little bit, that classification is a bit wrong, potentially. It follows the rule of three sort of myth, when we look at the, like, obviously, I think if we were to speak broad, like, we give broad definitions to the tribes here in the modern day, I do believe personally, that it is easier just to generalize here and just say, the three big groups of Anglo-Saxons. Now, I'm saying this as someone who has not done further dives into the migration period here, right? But essentially, it was right. We don't see, and I don't know if he'll talk about this, but what ends up getting talked about, right, is like the heptarchy, and then also where these places settled, right? We always talk about the Saxons settling in Wessex and Sussex and stuff like that. The Angles in like Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, the Jutes in like Kent, and probably another one that I'm forgetting the name of. I don't know if that was 7. No, I think that was only 6. I'm forgetting one of them, but it doesn't matter. Right, but of course the heptarchy is wrong because there were more kingdoms than that, and because of how imperium worked within Britain, there were more than 7 kingdoms. But it's just nicer to say 7 kingdoms because that's like a nicer number. It's more aesthetic. But the demarcations of Angles and Saxons living in specific areas is not correct. There is plenty, like, there's, right, while we do have plenty of evidence of like Anglian stuff in Mercia, there's also a good bit of, from the same time period roughly, of Saxon like pottery, jewelry, or whatever in the same areas, right? So the migration wasn't as like, you know, defined borders as I think we like to describe it as, most and a lot of which in ways I have done in the past as well. I've made that mistake when I knew less about the migration period. But yeah, it is interesting.
Vocabulary in 3 major rounds. First was Old Norse words from Scandinavian Viking raiders and settlers in the 8 and 900s. Second was French words from Monsieur Guillaume le Conquérant and the Normans in 1066. As the language of the royalty and aristocracy, French vocab was for upper class topics, so the animal cow comes from the Old English queue, but the delicacy beef comes from the French bœuf. But England and France wouldn't stay by
That's why I love English, though. Like, it's so fucked up. It's great.
buds forever, so from the 13 and 1400s,
Oh,
when
damn,
the
we are already in Middle English. Okay.
Hundred Years' War was going on, English sought to distinguish itself from French by turning
So I guess there really is no lasting Roman or Celtic influence on the language.
to Latin as a source of
Or at
vocabulary.
least one that isn't sizable. Well, I guess we got the Latin here, but it's, you know, not Roman Latin. It's, you know, Latin after fall of Rome.
This continued into the Renaissance era as Latin words infused English, like, for instance, infuse from the Latin infundere. This also gave us a few quirky rules like not ending a sentence with a preposition or not splitting infinitives because
I'm reading
that's how
that.
it works
Those
in
are
Latin.
smart
Thus, to
things.
barbarously split an infinitive is, barbaric. Those were the 3 main sources of vocabulary over the centuries, but other words sprinkled in from trade with the Dutch, Spanish, and Germans. Plenty of science vocab comes from Arabic, and some extra Greek words gave English that touch of class, he said in the most non-biased way possible. That's more or less how English got its words, but borrowing words from visitors and neighbors is essentially how every language acquires its vocabulary. English speaks its imports proudly, but it's not an outlier for having them. This story suitably traces the history of English etymology, but it doesn't explain how English uses its words, how it spells and says them, how it puts them together with grammar. Grammar gets less attention than etymology because rules are more complicated than disparate little words, but we can put this into context all the same. Consider the evolution of modern, Middle, and Old English through the sequence of Shakespeare, Chaucer, and Beowulf. A juxtaposition so handy it's come
Back in the Skyrim symbol.
up on OSP before. Shakespeare's poems and plays are just an early version of our modern English. It has some word order that feels wacky to us, plus your classic these and thous and some spiffier words we may need to look up, but the rules for how words fit together and sentences get built are the same core rules we have today. Same core grammar. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are Middle English. The macro level grammar is similar enough that we can understand the original text, but the words themselves appear very odd.
When that April with his showers soothes, the drought of March hath perked to the root, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the fluor. Or is it liqueur? Flower. Oh, it's probably liqueur. Flower. I don't know what the fuck I read.
Odd. He comes after the Norman French influence, but well before we got our modern spellings. When that April with his showers suits is close enough to when that April with his showers sweet, but it's undeniably different. You kind of have to unfocus your eyes and feel the words rather than read them, because the rules for how we spell words today are different. Then there's Beowulf, which is functionally unintelligible to modern readers. This is post-Viking and pre-French, but there's a lot more different about this than just a pièce of French vocabulaire here and there. We've got letters out of Old Norse like thorn and eth and ash and words that are entirely unrecognizable. The poem opens with lines I'm not even gonna try. It means lo
Wait. Qui Gardena in Gerdigam Hjodkinninga Prim Gefrunen Hutha Eiflingas Ellen Femiden.
We have heard of spear danes in days of yore, of folk kings' prowess, how the princes wrought deeds of valor, but just trying to compare them. What? Sorry, what I actually meant to say was, what?
What?
It's only a jump of a few
Blue,
hundred
we're
years from
funny.
Chaucer, and yet this is an English so distant from us that it may as well be a different language entirely. Is it even the same language? Now that's an interesting question. By lineage, yes, but practically, no it is not. So let's dig deeper to explore the third layer of English through the lens of grammar. Comparing English to its Germanic relatives, it has some weird linguistic omissions. For one, the Germanic languages all have grammatical gender and case. If those terms sound odd, it's because we don't have them in English. By gender, we don't mean distinguishing between he or she, Mr. or Miss, but what's the gender of a cup, a table, a tank? Gender typically sets the ending of a word and the article that goes in front of it. So in French, the cup is la tasse, feminine. English fully does not do that, nor does it have case, which sets the function of a noun in a sentence and the
Honestly,
word.
I hate the gendered language just because it's like, why? It doesn't, like, for my brain it doesn't click. Why are we providing, why is the cup a feminine thing? Like my head can't wrap around any of that. It's like, why is it gendered in any, like, they have non-gendered language in the language, right? Like they have, like, why isn't it just make it non, like, I don't understand. I should not be having to think about, like, hmm, would that be a masculine thing or a feminine thing that I'm looking at? No, it's fucking stupid.
Ending changes to reflect that. In English, we do it with word order. I throw an alligator to my friend. You know the thrower, the object being thrown, and where it's going just
It's so good.
by its position in the
Intuitive.
sentence. If I say to my friend an alligator throw I, the word order isn't helping us make sense of it, so it takes a second to sort out what's being thrown to whom. And if you've ever tripped up on the difference between who and whom, that's because it's a vanishingly rare example of case in the wild. We do more
Yeah, I always look, like, I try and use whom now and again in my writing because of how at times it can flow with the words. I care more for word flow and general feel of my sentence structure in paragraphs more so than I do for like truly grammatical correctness. I don't give a fuck about grammatical correctness so long as, like, if in my mind, if you can understand what is being communicated and it gets across the feeling better than it being grammatically correct, then it's a better structure than it being grammatically correct in my eyes. Um, uh, one example I think would be Tolkien's run-on sentences. Though of course that man was a master of the English language, he of course was still being grammatically correct. But also, like, he still would not have been grammatically incorrect in putting um periods here and there or whatever, right, in his run-on sentences. But it flows better by it being marked by periods or semicolons and whatever instead of a period, because a period is a hard stop. That's kind of what I mean. You know? But yeah, I try and use whom now and again because of just how it flows, but I'm like, wait a minute. Is this the right usage of the word whom? I'm not sure because language hard.
mark the possessive case by putting an apostrophe s on a word's ending or throwing of in front of it, but by and large, cases elude our understanding. English is the outlier among the Germanic gangs for the two big features it doesn't have, but what it does have might be even weirder. Namely, do. Do you know why we put the word do in our sentences? Before my research, I did not. It doesn't do any essential lifting, but it is nonetheless essential to not sounding like a madman. And what's with that ing?
Hold on, let me hear that again and then.
Put the word do in our sentences? Before my research, I did not. It doesn't do any essential.
It doesn't anything. It doesn't do anything. Now, I feel like that's a pretty important word in that sentence there.
Lifting, but it is nonetheless essential to not sounding like a madman. And what's with that ing ending? On paper, the present form of to listen is I listen, but if someone asks what you're doing and you say I listen to the silly history man, they'll look at you funny because the natural response is I'm listening. This continuous present tense and do verbs make English quite the oddball among the Germanics, so now let's learn why. Walk with me, viewers, as we reminisce about the cool autumn days of 450 AD. The Roman armies have left Britannia, and Germanic tribes of Anglo Saxons and Jutes have come across the North Sea to reside in their new home. I remember it blissfully. The newcomers spoke a descendant of Proto-Germanic we can call Old English, while the pre-existing locals held on to their Celtic languages, Common Brittonic, which was a Latin-influenced form of Celtic, plus Old Welsh and Cornish in Wales and Cornwall respectively. And wouldn't you know, those Celtic languages have early equivalents of an ing present tense and those goofy little
Wait. Oh my god, it does have Celtic influence!
do verbs. Ah, a match. Frustratingly, we don't have good written evidence for this in English until several centuries later, but we can be confident it was there from early in the linguistic context on the basis that writing is a fundamentally conservative medium. We know with confidence that spoken Latin was diverging from the written standard since the 400s AD, yet it's not until the 10 to 1300s that those Romance vernaculars get widely circulated in writing. Similar deal here. After the Celts were subjugated, little linguistic differences seeped into colloquial Old English over the centuries, but even by the 8 or 900s, works like Beowulf would stick firmly to a traditional literary register. No Celticisms allowed. In every language, in every era, there's a disconnect and a lag time between formal writing and common speech. So that's what Old English gained after its trip to Britain, but what about the features it lost? For that, we look to the Vikings, who didn't just import a bunch of words, but handily slimmed down Old English by, well, not being the best at speaking it. See, when the Danes and Norwegians came to England, they spoke Old Norse, the ancestor of modern Scandinavian languages. Both it and Old English had case and gender at the time of the Viking Age, and overall the languages were similar enough for the Vikings and their new English wives to roughly understand each other, but
Yeah, he's saying the thing I said.
not quite pick up on those finicky word endings. In a few generations of speaking and raising children in a mix of both languages, Old English and Old Norse hybridized, so plenty of words crossed over, that's the easy stuff, but grammar is harder, so gender, case, and verb conjugations got dropped. Now we do actually see a bit of document evidence for this, as Northumbria shows these changes first, and just so happened to be the heaviest area of Norse settlement. So at the end of the millennium, we have a conservative register of Old English demonstrated in Beowulf, yet the implication of a significantly different spoken English. How then did we jump to Chaucer's English 3 centuries later? I invite you to join me as we blame France. See, when the Normans came to England, there were not very many of the guys, yet French became the spoken language of the aristocracy and written language of state, replacing English.
How you say, skill problem? Baguette?
And sending it into a century-long blackout. French left its mark on English vocabulary, but was otherwise so insular that it didn't affect English grammar. Then, in the early 1200s, geopolitics.
Hold on. I accept your words, but I reject your vibes, good sir.
Was otherwise so insular that it didn't affect English grammar. Then, in the early 1200s, geopolitics happened and England politically decoupled from France, so English asserted itself as the language of state. But here, the literary chain to Beowulfy Old English was broken, so their new starting point for written English was simply spoken English, and suddenly hundreds of years of Celtic and Scandinavian influence crashed onto the page at once. From there, the linguistic path through Chaucer, Shakespeare, and onto the modern day is quite straightforward in comparison. That is, with one planet-sized caveat. For everything we may tell ourselves, standard English is not standard. The processes that brought English new words and reorganized its grammar are happening all over the world in over 100 dialects and languages related to English. Not just American or Australian or regional accents, but African American vernacular English, Hawaiian Pidgin, Singlish, Jamaican Patois, Naija, Hinglish, and countless others. A startlingly vast wealth of cultures spread around the world that is an essential piece of the English lineage. English is a mess of a language, of course, but the sooner we realize it, the sooner we get to have fun with it. If we have to speak the damn thing, we may as well enjoy ourselves. Thank you for watching.
Yeah.
If you have the...
It's one of those things like, learn the rules before you break them sort of thing. But also, like, still going back to what I was talking about earlier with that one stupid English rule of I before E except after C, except for all these fucking exceptions, which seem to be more so the norm than the actual exception. The exception to the rule actually seems to be I before E except after C. Anyways, that was History Summarized, Why English is Such a Mess by Overly Sarcastic Productions. This was a great video. I think he did a fantastic job covering this, and I think he explained it really well. I thought it was well paced. I hope you guys enjoyed as well. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.